This is my interview with Claire Fox, who is the director of the Academy of Ideas. She also was a member of the European Parliament for North West England from 2019 to 2020, representing the Brexit Party. And this interview was really important because we discussed the latest with school children as they prepare to return to school. And we also discussed the current crisis facing universities and their teaching for next semester. So please enjoy. I'm joined by Claire Fox, the Director of the Academy of Ideas. Claire, thank you so much for joining me. Schools in Scotland have now reopened and some in Northern Ireland. England and Wales, their schools are planning to reopen for next week. We know children are low risk of getting ill from the virus. Children aged 5 to 14 are actually lower getting COVID than it is from a seasonal flu. Has the government done enough to protect children going back to school? And could they have gone back to school sooner?
Actually, I have a different approach. I don't even think the school should have closed. I think that if you look at a lot of the issues around the education of young people at the moment, the scandal around exam results or non-exam results, all of the confusion that's come from that, the huge amount of time that young people have missed in education. And at no point was there any evidence really from early on that young people were in danger from this virus. You might say, okay, a kind of precautionary principle set in, but I do think that there was an overreaction, and the closure of schools became a key way in some regards that closed society down, because schools are not just where you educate the young, but they're also the heart of the community. And the impact of closing schools inevitably led to an unravelling or a rather deeper lockdown than was necessary, because people had to then reorganise around childcare and looking after their kids and so on. And symbolically, it just led to that absolute climate of fear. And I was very disappointed that teachers in particular weren't more leading advocacy for the importance of education during this time.
Because many countries, such as Sweden, never actually closed their schools. And Denmark did actually try to get their schools back a lot sooner. So has the government just left this way too late?
I think so. I mean, I think what's happened is, we were faced with an unknown pandemic, and I have every sympathy with those in charge of every country trying to decide how to react. And we didn't initially know how lethal it would be, and so on and so forth. But I think the more and more that the evidence was in, the more we understood the virus, the more we overreacted. That was what was ironic. I mean, it's one thing saying, in case it's going to kill everybody straight away. And I understood all of the arguments around the NHS being overwhelmed, but that's why it became so irrational that there was a focus on schools, where in fact we knew that, we knew nothing else. We knew that the vulnerable group was the elderly, and that young people were actually, luckily, thankfully, not susceptible to this virus. So I do think that the government's reaction in relation to this has shown a casual disdain for education, a focus on the young. I mean, I would argue that for some years, overprotecting young people, and I mean overprotecting, a kind of panicky reaction in terms of young people's health and welfare has been detrimental to young people. So we know that after some time that we've created a situation where young people aren't encouraged to play outside, because there's fear of stranger danger, getting knocked over by a car. In other words, the precautionary principle has had a terrible impact in terms of young people's ability to grow up on their own without supervision and surveillance and panic reactions. So I think that all you have to do is to ever say, think of the children, and you can kind of bring in some rather illiberal situation.
Because yesterday, I was just going to say yesterday,
that's all right.
Surgeon, she's announced that all children in Scotland in secondary schools have been advised to wear masks in communal areas. Do you think Boris should take the same approach in England?
No, I mean, there's the evidence of marginal benefit in terms of virus spread, and really that's not that convincing, and the scientists are in disagreement. It was seen to be almost a psychological way to encourage people to go out and about. I think that behavioral psychology has backfired, because I think the wearing of masks has generally made people more fearful rather than more confident. But, I'm not an anti-masker. I can cope. But one of the points about going back to school is to approach a generational question by saying, look, this group of young people at a very important time in their lives, and I mean, from 5 onwards, but throughout being young and throughout your teenage years and all the rest of it, missing a whole year of socialization, effectively half a year, not just of education, but of living in any way normally, of confining people to the home and so on, has been detrimental in not just educationally but psychologically. So the return to school, you would want to be as normal as possible, as human as possible. And as school is partly about building relationships, both with your peers, but also with your teacher, education happens through relationship building, seeing faces, there's more to communication than simply, read the book and then you'll understand. So this idea of bringing masks in that Nicola Sturgeon is indulged in, I think, is wholly detrimental. And it will distort yet once more the experience of growing up, and not with a health benefit. That's the important point. It's constantly being posed as, oh, well, we have to do this because we're protecting your health. But in fact, I would argue that it's detrimental to the broad health and well-being of young people.
There's a lot of focus on the children, and rightly so, but are the teachers, are they prepared enough? Do you think the government's done enough to support teachers going back to school in England next week?
Well, there's always more that you could say government can do, and I'm certainly not uncritical of the communications of governments in, actually in all of the administrations, that's Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the UK government. So you could say that there's lots of questions, like how do you react what are the guidelines if, for example, 2 kids in this class get COVID, or they're transmitters? Oh, well, what do you do? Or if a teacher gets it? So there's a kind of lots of ifs and buts. But if anything, I'm fearful that the rules and regulations have made the reopening of schools rather so bureaucratic that a lot of teachers have wanted to avoid it, as much for the bureaucracy as anything else. I don't, however, think that it's up to the government to tell teachers how to run schools, or head teachers. I mean, in some ways, I would argue for more teacher autonomy. I think it's been dispiriting that the trade unions that represent teachers have gone off to the government and said, tell us what to do to open schools safely, when the trade unions have spent the last decades telling government that actually teachers are the people who understand schools better than anyone else. It's also been dispiriting, though, that the sense of vocation associated with education, teachers are people who you would want to be the flag carriers for education at all costs. If you think historically, teachers as your kind of heroes and heroines are the kind of people who would teach, kids in the most thriving countries, in schools where there was famine, where there was war going on, and they've said we'll open the school regardless. And yet here we are in the UK with the teachers being the ones who demanded that schools were closed down, and not all teachers, of course, but it's come largely from teacher unions. But I don't want to just union bash. It's almost as though teachers forgot their core role, which is to educate young people. And I think that given young people a lead in terms of confronting a difficult situation and taking it on. And I do think it requires a certain bravery. It's not because I think teachers are going to be exposed, but because giving a lead means that you say there is some risk, but there's always some risk in life. The risk is not that great now that we understand the virus. We're going to open the schools because the most important thing now is education.
It's obviously like we can't forget there have been some schools open throughout, and some teachers have been teaching virtually throughout. Many students are still awaiting confirmation whether they will get into their chosen university after the government's U-turn fiasco. It's now been reported by the Sunday Times that Gavin Williamson actually went on holiday to Scarborough the week before the A-level results came out.
About whether he went on holiday to Scarborough. He could have gone on holiday to Scarborough and it could have still been well organised. It seems incomprehensible to me that they didn't anticipate that if you cancel exams, this is going to cause some problems, and that you've actually got people who need to know how they got on. And the fact that they seem to think that it could be solved technically, you know, the algorithm question, you know, oh, if we put in place a fancy algorithm, we'll be able to sort this out, showed a certain disregard. And I think that they just underestimated the importance of what doing your A-levels would mean or doing your GCSEs would mean, because it's not just a route to university or a route to a job. It's also a sense of what have you achieved? What have you worked for? How are you being assessed? Are you being taken seriously? And, you know, the class of 2020 may now have got grades based on their teachers' assessments that get them into university and so on. But I think you'd always feel as though you weren't really tested, you know, in that way that you, even though we all hate exams, in some ways it's a rite of passage, you know. And one of the great things in life, when I say great, I mean, is when you do better at one exam than you'd expected. You then maybe don't do as well in another, but it's your responsibility. It's part of growing up. You realise, oh, if only I'd put the work in, if I'd only answered that question. Now people will feel a sense of not knowing that, I think. I think that Gavin Williamson and the whole of the Department of Education, however, just didn't, you know, the fact that they didn't understand the significance of schooling in this period and what it would mean then, as I say, is to underestimate why closing schools and cancelling exams would be such an important thing for young people, depriving them of something very key in their lives. Just when you were saying about a lot of schools have been open and teachers have been teaching virtually, it's been such a mixed picture. And so there's also been a lack of regard. So it's almost as though they were prepared to take on, you know, kind of just, everyone will say, oh, well, a lot of the schools were teaching it. I mean, I know lots of teachers, you know, where there was a situation where there was meant to be maybe 70 key workers or vulnerable young people in schools, maybe 17 would turn up and nothing much else would happen, right? You also got a situation where some teachers worked their socks off in terms of delivering lessons, although they were never the same via Zoom as meeting face-to-face or what have you, or however, there were also a lot of teachers who, you know, not through their own fault, but the school didn't organise that. And I've talked to parents who will say, we never even heard from the school. So this is a catastrophic impact. It can be got over. But I think the main thing is just this sense that when you realise the adult world has stopped, you know, when the adult world is frightened to go back to work, when it's encouraged to, when you as a young person are looking for leadership from the grown-ups and the grown-ups are behaving like frightened children or don't appear to understand the significance for you of being educated, then that I think will have, that could make you have a sense of grievance if you're young. I get that.
And after the U-turn, there's many universities that are now offering financial incentives, like Durham University. I think they're one of the first actually to give bursaries and some discounts on accommodation for next year to kind of incentivize students to defer until next year. Is this going to have a negative impact on next year's cohorts when they apply to university?
But it's also, well, first of all, the universities might try and buy time and try and use that year to get themselves ready for next year. But I think asking people to defer is, you know, again, lacks understanding of what it will mean. You know, what are you going to do in your gap year?
Exactly.
When there's no jobs, we're facing a depression and people have already been confined to home. I mean, it's bad enough that you've been forced into a situation of, you know, being with your family fairly intensely in lockdown, and now just at that very brink of the exciting adventure of leaving home, you're told to stay put. I mean, that I would think would be very demoralizing for people. I also think it's entirely unnecessary, by the way. I would like to imagine that universities were gearing up to accept or preparing for many of their new intake, their second and third years and their postgrads, but also this new intake of first year students who they know have had a rough time, and really giving them an enriched educational experience at university. I mean, in some ways, universities have got a key role to play. And I'm an associate professor at the University of Buckingham, and I'm glad to say that they're preparing to fully open in September, encouraging every student to come back. Although they're going to have online lectures, they do want to have lots of face-to-face teaching. And then there are other universities who are just saying, don't bother coming back till January, and even then we'll see. And you just think there's no need for it. You know, you can actually run social distance seminars. I mean, you can deal with lectures in big rooms. I get that. But you should be trying to make the university come to life. Universities should be at the forefront of this re-energizing of society, which does need to return to some kind of normal. So it feels incredibly risk averse and, again, slightly cowardly that the university sector says to students, oh, just don't bother coming to us. You know, I really am dispirited. I think that's not something you would want to see from our great institutions. You would want them to be embracing the opportunity to make up in some ways to that 18, 19-year-old who's just about to turn up at university, not tell them that, oh, give us your money, but we don't want you to come anywhere near the campus.
Exactly. There's many students who are actually quite anxious about spending a whole year in their room, no face-to-face teaching. And if the library is restricted or shut completely, then where are they meant to go if they're just going to be stuck in their house?
Well, I think they'll probably find places to go, but one of the worst things is all these stupid rules and regulations, you know, don't mingle with somebody from another floor, or, you know, no parties, don't stay overnight. I mean, obviously, it's part of it, right? It's you're leaving home, you are start entering into the phase of being a grown-up, and part of that is, of course, the freedom to have fun and mix. And what I'm trying to say is that if you look at the regulations that have been brought in by many universities, they haven't even come from the scientists, right? They're actually adding on layers of complications. And I do know a situation whereby, you know, people who are doing vivas for different things, you know, where there's only meant to be 3 or 4 people in a room, and they still won't let that happen face to face. Some universities, they say no, do it all virtually. Now, this seems much more about universities watching their backs, you know, frightened that something might happen and they might be blamed, rather than considering what is in the best interests of knowledge and how you test that knowledge, and encouraging young people to enter into the world of the mind at universities. And they just seem, it's just unnecessary. So those universities, I think, by the way, who've got the courage to encourage students to come back to live as full a life as possible, I think they will be remembered as heroically rather than any other way. I think those institutions that have actually cowered and, you know, are saying to their lecturers, don't bother coming back. By the way, one thing to say, some university managements are trying to encourage their lecturers to come back, and it's their lecturers who don't want to go back. Because, you know, if you can deliver, I mean, it's such a faff having to go to work, isn't it? I mean, can you imagine? I mean, if you can sit at home and do your little work and give her the odd bit of a seminar via Zoom and then do the odd lecture, how much more pleasant to extend that summer holiday way into? I think it's disgraceful. Every academic should be chomping at the bit to get back into the university.
Especially when students are paying a lot of money for it. And it's not just that, but it is a business at the end of the day. Students are their consumers. And if the service is going to be different, is it fair?
Well, I hate the marketisation of higher education, and I don't like the notion of students as consumers, because I think it changes the balance of what going to university should be. But you're absolutely right to note that it's the universities themselves that have promoted that. I mean, they're the ones who say, we are delivering a service, give us your money, we put you first as consumers. I mean, it's not an approach I approve of, but they've marketed themselves on that and keeping students satisfied. So they are actually, as you have noted, rather shooting themselves in the foot if they go down this path, because you end up in a situation, well, they're definitely not delivering the service they promised. But isn't it horrible to even think of it like this? I mean, what I'm saying is, at the heart of the educational project, especially the higher education project, is you're initiating a whole new generation into the life of the mind. I mean, that might sound slightly romantic, but it's like you're opening them up to the level of higher study. That's what you're doing. They're kind of discovering their discipline in great detail, being opened up to all the new research and find, etc., etc. And there should be a joint excitement about that. For the university academic, it's an opportunity, and that's your vocation, to initiate in a whole new generation, as I say, to pass it on, as the phrase is. And for the undergraduate, it's the excitement of starting on this endeavour of really understanding your subject in detail, really getting stuck in and becoming an expert, or somebody who will really understand, whether it's medieval history or astrophysics, whatever it might be, right? You are on the path. That should be what drives everyone to want to go there. And also, we know that part of that is young people at that age of 18 beginning to say, and now I'm going to take responsibility for the world I live in. I'm starting to be a grown-up. I'm being treated as an adult at university, supposedly, and I'm going to now take responsibility for my life, and that will mean experimenting with what kind of person I am, whether I'm having a wild time, pushing the boat out, pushing the envelope, finding out who I am. All of these things are what makes going to university, or being in a university, potentially an exciting project. Now, for some years, there's been a kind of problem with this, which is that many young people have arrived at university rather fearful. First thing they've done is demand safe spaces to be looked after. They've been rather infantilized by the university administration, who've not treated them as young adults, but rather as consumers who need to be looked after, especially if their parents are paying the money and all this sort of thing. But nonetheless, I think that what gets jeopardized and gets lost in this coronavirus period is that what university should be for is actually being completely sidelined. And that seems to me to be a great tragedy.
Claire Fox, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much